Now, there's obviously enough apartments in China to house everybody, yet they're building billions more homes as we speak. And how does this relate to Evergrande's founder officially being criminally detained? Is the Chinese real estate sector going to collapse? Welcome to China Insider, I'm David Zhang. Now today we're going to focus more on the macro aspect of China's real estate and how it started, how it's going to go further. And we spent the last episode on how the political ties between different factions have been affecting the Evergrande situation. And today it is officially confirmed that the boss of Evergrande, Hui Ka Yin or Xu Jiayin, has been criminally detained in Beijing, as well as his second son, Peter Xu, is also detained. Now our topic today is because we know that what's happening with Evergrande is bound to happen with other real estate developers in China too. So I think this is going to be a situation where we're dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, and yet there seems to be no real solution forward from the Chinese regime. And people spend their life savings to buy a home in China, yet only they've been met with unfinished homes, and investors are trying to claw back their money, but they can't find anything. So where does this all lead? Well, it may look like Xi Jinping is trying to kill one to deter 1,000, or kill one chicken to deter the monkey, as the Chinese saying goes. What we're seeing now is that clearly Xi Jinping can't do much about the giant that is Evergrande. And so he's trying to turn this whole situation into a political one, but that's not the solution going forward. Obviously, Xu Jiayin will sit out in jail for decades, and now even though this is happening, Xi Jinping doesn't have a clear answer to what to do about Evergrande as the entity that's threatening to blow up in China. And so this is a political issue now instead of an economic one, but it's one where we don't see how this ends well for the CCP. The only solutions that Beijing has are communist ways, or the classic intervention, state planning tack. And in this case, there's a lot of problems. Now, this isn't just a Xi Jinping era problem. This is an accumulation of multiple decades of leadership leading up to this point. So you could say that this is pinning the blames on many more than just Xi Jinping's policies, but rather it's a generational issue. And I always say this: real estate in China is a Ponzi scheme. Now, the problem with real estate all the way goes back to the 1980s with the reform and opening up. Back in the days, Chinese people didn't have money. When the reform and opening up happened, there was a sudden accumulation of wealth between the Chinese population, and so people needed a place to spend money. And now China had a lot of underdeveloped land back in the days, and so developers caught the opportunity to quickly blow up China's real estate sector into what we're seeing today. And then this whole thing became more apparent after 2008, when China didn't go through the financial crisis that the rest of the world did, and so China kept going with their real estate. You had people with millions of pocket change started investing in real estate, hoping to make money, right? And so there was a drive to push for more buildings, and more investments and bigger companies rose up from that to create bigger projects. And so over the period of 20 years, from 2000 until now, what we saw is a big blow up of the industry from particularly back in the days when it was single projects to now it's mega $1 million, billions of units in projects. And so the scale has gone up, and so has the ambitions of these companies that are doing real estate in China. So this was all nice, right? But there were a few scary moments back in the days, like in 2011. There was supposed to be a burst of the real estate housing bubble. It didn't end up happening because the CCP, again, through their state intervention, they were able to calm the storm, pushed it forward into the future. And now everything's sort of accumulating into this disaster. And you have to remember, right, none of this would have been possible in terms of the real estate development if it wasn't for the CCP wanting to grow it. And so they made it into a reality. And that reality is quite scary because in China, everything is a political one. So for example, with the real estate, local governments are heavily tied into this. They get money from land sales to developers. Developers want to buy more land so that they can build more projects. And in turn, it creates a vicious cycle of constantly wanting more things to build and constantly wanting people to buy more houses. And the government plays an important role because they encourage this, right? They say the more you sell, the more land that we sell to you, the more money that we have to do other things. And so we also encourage developers to keep building. This was all nice when everything was still going on with, high demands, high consumption in society, and people had money. But now it's a whole different story. People no longer have money. If they have a lot of money, they aren't willing to spend it. They're saving it. And so it looked for a long time like it was where the bigger you go, the more money you make, and everybody was a player in this. And it seemed like everyone at least was benefiting from the overall situation. If you're small, you made a little bit of money. If you're big, you make bigger amounts of money. And policies also, right, encouraged this all to happen because over the last 2 decades, you had the government who wants to have more land sales, and then so they can generate revenue. There's officials who want more because then they can take more for themselves. And then there are developers who are so ambitious, like Evergrande, that they want to dominate the entire industry. And so you had more projects going up, and you had more projects than what was demanded and what was needed for the Chinese population. So now you have billions of homes with nobody in it, right? You have ghost cities and all these problems. So essentially everything was driven by greed, and everybody knew that eventually one day things were going to go out of hand, but nobody wanted to get out before that happened. So the CCP turned this whole thing into a giant Ponzi scheme. I call it a Ponzi scheme because the government and the developers and banks and the investors, they're all in it to gain some. Nobody here wants to be a loser. It may seem like the investors, like home buyers, may be the losers because they have to spend the money, but actually they look like they were also going to make a lot of money. And Chinese people saved up their entire life just to buy a house. And remember, the Chinese real estate sector accounts for 30% of its entire economy, and it is all linked to every aspect of society. China's real estate is really a high leverage, high loan system. And so Evergrande, along with all the other real estate developers, they all use the same formula here to get going and become really big. So in the beginning, Evergrande, what they did was very simple, right? They borrowed some money, they built some houses, they made some profit, and then they used more money they borrowed more money, and then they made more profits, and then rents. But eventually at some point, it was that the amount of cash they had in the cycle became much less than the actual amount of projects that they were putting up. So more things were being put up, but not enough money was being made. And this is bound to happen eventually, right? We all understand this is, if you're artificially creating demand, you don't have enough of the funds to back it up, you're not going to generate actual amount of cash flow. They were banking on the idea that people would constantly continue to buy. They didn't think that at one point there was going to be zero COVID, there was going to be all these political issues. So they borrowed too much money, right? They have too many projects that aren't finished, and then they don't have enough investors. So then if you don't have enough cash circulating in the system to help you kind of continue to fill the hole that you created, and that hole is getting bigger and bigger because you keep borrowing more money, at one point it's going to crash. So in 2021, Evergrande crashed. It defaulted on its debt, and we saw how big it was, right? But this isn't just one company. This is the formula for every single company in China. So if one falls, the other ones are on the path to fall in the same way. Now, some have different situations, obviously, but the same type of formula apply. And you can imagine how this happened, right? It was get rich really fast, a sudden boom of everything. So let me give you an example, right? Say a company has about $300 million on hand, and then they go to the bank, they borrow $700 million. So they have a total of, in assets, $1 billion, right? But they have a gearing ratio, or the amount of liabilities that they have is about 70%, right? 700 million in 1 billion, so that's about 70%. Okay, and then so they go and build their first project, and then they take and they make about 300 million, okay? Normally a company would, say, finance a project, right? And then try to make that $700 million back so that they can pay back the loans, and then they go and do the second project. But not in China. What China does is the companies would use that first 300 million that they have already as capital, and then they would take more loans from the bank. So now they take another additional 700 million. So now they have a total of 1.4 billion in liability. And so what happens with their initial liability percentage, which was 70%, it's called a gear ratio, now it has exploded to 83%. Then they do another 700 million on top of that. Now they have, their gear ratio is now 87%. So you see how the discrepancy between the amount of liabilities that they have versus the actual amount of money that they should hold on to. That ratio is so off. So there's so much more in liabilities. Now what happens is, rather than you completing an existing project, they invest in multiple at the same time and then try to make profits from the first to deal with more. And so they're always behind on their payments and always behind on the amount of money that they should be making. And so because there's not actually a lot of demand or enough money in the system, then things are not profitable. And then that's what happened basically with a lot of the homes in China. They became something called a rotting home, or a rotten home. They're unfinished projects. They don't have basic utilities set up. They don't have elevators. All these community services aren't set up, and workers, contractors aren't being paid. So the money somehow disappeared. That's because it's a Ponzi scheme. There's never enough money in the system to begin with. And so we saw a lot of this back in the days, right? Now, if you look at Evergrande, they have about 800 unfinished homes at, I think, 2021 when they defaulted. Country Garden, another real estate developer, has about 3,000 plus unfinished projects by the time it defaulted on its first payment. There's clearly a level of deception here for the general public. And so when in August 2021, when Evergrande defaulted on its first payment, it had 1.96 trillion yuan, or about 300 billion US dollars in liability. That's huge. If you think about how much that is, right? That's bigger than the GDP of New Zealand or Kuwait. And then multiply that one company by however many other developers there are in China. So that's why I call it ticking time bombs everywhere. And this extends into not just the real estate sector. There's the trust, shadow banking sector, the medical insurance sector, there's finances, stock market. There's anything that has to do with money has the same level of risk. And so they were just banking on the economy being good. People had decent amount of money to buy and the interest was there. So now the local governments can't get any more money from the land sales because the developers don't have enough money, because there's not enough demand to buy houses. At one point they were forced to not lower the home prices, and then later on they reversed it, and then now they still don't have enough demand. So clearly it's a political problem, right? People just don't want to buy anything. They're afraid that another pandemic lockdown is going to come their way. And then over the weekend there was a report that Evergrande has decided to stop their debt restructuring process, which means that instead of promising to pay back the investors in 10 years from now on when they turn the profit around, they've just decided to kaboom everything, right? Bust all the investments, screw them over essentially, and say, well, I can't do anything, I won't be able to pay it back. One of the reasons I think why, it's because the size of the hole, right, what they essentially have to deal with is way bigger than what's being told to the public. And so the amount of money that they're going to make over the next 10 years won't be enough to cover anything, or that's if they even make any money. So in other words, the real liabilities of Evergrande alone is more than 340 billion US dollars, the public number that we all know, right? And that's just the overseas proportion. I think right now the CCP doesn't worry or can't even think about the overseas portion. They have to worry about what's happening domestically in China. How are they going to deal with the investors who are home buyers? So at this point, you might think that, well, these companies were too big to fail, right? We know all about too big to fail businesses. And the reality is this, right? In China, everything is controlled by the CCP. If they just let Evergrande fail initially, right, just don't bail them out, and then that might have not extended to today to accumulate to so much problems, and there's could have been capitalism or competition. Obviously that never happens in China, but that would have been the better way to do this. And instead what they did was try to shove the amount of containment into Evergrande's, kind of like contain the bomb, until now they really can't do anything, so they just say, well, we gave up, right? And then we're going to arrest the founder, but what is he going to do? He doesn't have any money on him. One thing to note though, he did file for Evergrande a Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection in New York, which means that his overseas assets are protected from China's seize of assets, right? So the Chinese government can't grab that amount of overseas or offshore liabilities or the assets that he has overseas and bring it back to China. So he kind of played or went up the CCP here a little bit, because he's saying that whatever I took out of China, it's protected. It's handled by the United States government instead of the Chinese government. That's going to screw over the domestic part, but I think that was pretty interesting. One of the other reasons why the CCP was prolonging this whole thing with Evergrande for so long is there's actually a few reasons for this, right? If you think about it, right? One is you keep the investors, especially the foreign investors, interested or hopeful. And you can kind of drag this thing along for a while. And you can also give you time to come up with solutions, potential problem-solving ideas, maybe try to liquidate some of the assets that Evergrande still has in China to try to fill the gap. But again, the sheer size of it, right? And then you could also think of it like it's trying to cover up failure of the entire economy and the way that they operate for so long, right? Because remember, this was everybody wins, right? It's a win-win scenario for real estate in China. So if they say that this is failing, that's going to send shockwaves across the world, across the entire economy. And so they want to keep it tight and keep it silent, right? And then there's also the whole Ponzi scheme idea. So Evergrande is this big deception or a big fraud of lie. What's going to happen to all the other real estate developers who have the same business model as Evergrande? Are they all repeating the same lie? Are they all doing this Ponzi scheme? That, again, is going to be dramatically impactful for the Chinese homebuyer. Like Xu Jiayin personally, he's basically decided to sacrifice himself to move assets enough for his entire family to live wealthy outside of China. And I heard that he set up a trust fund for his son, one of his son, and his grandson, worth billions of US dollars. And they can live comfortably for the rest of their lives, while Xu Jiayin, he has to personally sit in jail and rot. What does this indicate for the overall economy or the real estate sector? Why haven't we seen an implosion yet? And this question is from our last video. It's from the Saranaras hope that I pronounced it right. Quote, despite hearing lots of news about local governments running out of money, high youth unemployment, real estate sector failing, it hasn't seemed to yet manifest in any singular large event. Is this coming at all, or can the CCP keep it hidden well enough? Is there some other event that needs to happen before the rest of the dominoes fall? So that's a great question. Now, the Chinese economy, like I said, it's all bound together, right, by one thing, and that is the CCP. Now, everything is political and everything requires state control. And that being said, I think the Evergrande situation is the one to trigger the is it Black Swan, Gray Rhino event? Anyways, these are impactful events. It's going to dramatically change the Chinese economy, and it's happening pretty fast. So I see this happening right now. You got to remember, the CCP has all these holes that they have to fill, right? Everywhere they're basically doing the same type of Ponzi scheme. Not enough funds, but too many debt to actually be solved, and they're all just keeping it hidden, right? What's going to happen is it's going to build up, and eventually at one point it's going to blow up. Think of it like a rubber balloon. Now the amount of bad stuff you can put in it is a lot, and it can expand to a huge size before it blows up. All it takes is one, right, prick it, and then it's kaboom. So I think it's coming, and I think Evergrande is the indicator that this is happening now, because over the years the real estate sector has that bubble, right? It was about to burst, but every time the CCP has been able to keep it down because we haven't had the amount of political control that the Xi Jinping government, the regime, has been able to do. So I think this is the point. Hope I made it clear a little bit about what's really going on with China's real estate, how it happened, where it's going now, and why I think Evergrande is the indicator for the implosion of the Chinese economy. Now, if you enjoy this content, make sure to like the video, but also comment below question or thought about this topic, and then I can answer some of the questions in our next video. All right, and also subscribe to the channel too. All right, until next time, I'm David Zhang. This is China Insider. Bye-bye.